Welcome to our PHP tutorial. Today we're going to learn PHP from scratch. If you've never learned any programming before, this is a great place to start. We're going to take everything from absolute beginner to somewhere you can build basically anything that you want. Now, my experience in programming and in teaching programming tells me that it's usually a bit hard to actually learn it if you don't have some form of a project or something interesting to build. So that's why we're going to make this video revolving around a project that should be worth a lot of money. At least it's going to be revolving around something that was just sold for $44 billion to Mr. Elon Musk. I'm of course talking about Twitter. Yeah, we're going to model today's tutorial on Twitter. We're not necessarily going to build every single feature of it, but we're going to spend the next hour or two looking at the different features and how you might build something like that in PHP. Now, in the beginning, we're just going to take things simple and we're going to make some simple files. But as we go along and things start to get more complex and we start to have more and more code, we're going to also want to talk about how you structure that code. And that's going to be part of this as well. And another thing is that PHP is not that good at doing things in and of itself. It really needs a bit of help from a database to be really fun. You need to write some HTML with it. And there are different things that you might want to know in order to work with this. But we're going to take those things as we go along. So I'll make sure that you're not going to fall off even if you haven't really worked with those things in the past. So with all of that out of the way, let's just go ahead and build Twitter. The first thing you're going to need in order to build this is you're going to need a couple of tools on your computer. So you're going to need to install MySQL or some other database. PHP, of course, and then you'll need a browser like a Chrome browser. You probably have one, but I like to use the Chrome browser because it's the most widely used browser. So if it works and it looks good in the Chrome browser, then it looks good on most people's computers, right? And then, of course, Visual Studio Code, which is really good for syntax highlighting and to just help us out with our code in general. So make sure you have those things installed. If you need help installing it, I have a video on installing those exact 4 things on Windows and another video about how to install it on Mac. It's a little bit different, and especially on Mac, it's a little bit difficult because you have to install Homebrew first. But use those videos and come back here and let's build something amazing. Let's just hit the ground running. Let's try and create something really simple, see that everything works, and then start talking about how everything really fits together. So I'll just go ahead here and create a new folder. I'll call it PHP course. I'll drag it into Visual Studio Code. I'm not going to save any configurations here, but here I have my folder, so now I can work with that directly inside of Visual Studio Code. I don't need this Get Started guide. So if I hit this plus sign, I can create a new file, and I'm going to call it index.php. And you can see that the icon here changes to this PHP elephant once I've done that, because it knows that this is a PHP file. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to write $PHP, and then I'm going to write echo hello world. Because whenever you learn programming, you always have to start out with a program that says hello world. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this folder and say new terminal at folder. If you're on Windows, then there's going to be an address bar up here that says what folder you're inside. If you click on that, not on any of the folders, but next to the folders, and you type in CMD and hit enter, then it's going to open up the command prompt in Windows in that folder. So that's going to do essentially the same thing that we're doing here. And then the command is going to be the exact same thing. So PHP -s and then localhost 8080. And now it just says started. It should look like this. If it doesn't, post a comment below. I try to help people out whenever they have problems. But now we actually have something running on localhost 8080. So if we go into our browser, I have a Chrome browser open here. I can type in localhost 8080. And it says, hello world. Now, we can discuss a couple of things from here because this is a PHP file and it says echo and then it comes out here. So first of all, you should view your PHP files as basically HTML files. So everything in a PHP file is treated like HTML until the point where you write $PHP. So if I wanted to just write some completely normal HTML up here, this is completely standard HTML. You always have your HTML, your head, and your body. And inside of that, you can have your header 1 that says, hi mom. I'll hit save. This is terrible formatting, but let's just fix that real quick. Oh, this should be inside of the body, of course. That's why you use proper formatting to catch things like that. I'll hit save, and now it says hi mom as a header 1 because it's just reading the HTML, and then still says hello world as regular text. But if we take a look here in the inspector, we can right click and say inspect. And then we have our JavaScript console down here in the bottom. We have our CSS in the middle and our HTML in the top. Let's move things around a little bit here so we can see what's going on. Up here, we have a document that's exactly equal to the document over here, because this is what the browser is reading when it goes into this page. But there's a couple of things that are different. First of all, it just says hello world. It doesn't say echo and it doesn't say PHP. So that's because whenever you go into PHP, that's how I'm going to phrase it throughout this video, that when you go into PHP by using this, then everything is going to be interpreted and turned into something else. And then whatever is printed out is going to be part of the final HTML document that's actually sent to the browser. So you need to envision that what we had running in our terminal window here, that this is our server, and this might as well be on a completely different computer somewhere else, in the cloud or hosted somewhere. But what we get here in the browser is what we would get on our normal computers, on our desktop computers, and what we would get on our smartphones or whatever we use to access these things. Now, we have a couple of different tools up here. We can go up over into sources, and over here we can see that it says index. And here we can see the actual HTML. So this is the HTML that we received from the server. And once again, it's a little bit different from what we actually coded, but that's the way it's supposed to be. Now, another thing that's kind of interesting is normally you'd want to write index.php after a /, after the localhost and the port number you started PHP on. But you don't need to do that if the file is called specifically index.php, because PHP itself knows that if you're not specifying any specific file name, then it should go for the file that's named index.php. That's just the way things are set up. So we don't need to write that when that's the file name. But if we were to rename this and call it index set, something like that, then this is not going to work anymore. It's not like it's just finding anything. It has to be specifically called index. And now we can load it again. Now, one of the great things and one of the benefits of using PHP is that you can do so much with very, very little code, because it just completely intermingles your database and your SQL with your HTML. And as a matter of fact, PHP stands for Personal Homepage Hypertext Preprocessor. Hypertext, as in HTML, stands for Hypertext Markup Language. PHP is basically built to pre-process your HTML. So that's the primary purpose now. PHP is a server language, and you can do anything with it that you want to do on your server, including writing all the scripts that you want to send out to your clients. And that's all great, but generally that's the purpose of it. That also means that the worst part about PHP is that you can do a lot of things with very little code, because you completely intermingle everything. You don't want to intermingle everything. You want your database things for themselves. You want your HTML as its own thing. and then you'll want your backend as the same thing. So as we start out here, we're gonna allow this intermingling, but we're gonna separate things and separate concerns a little bit later in the video. What I'll show you is we added all of this HTML right here, and actually it's not valid HTML because we put this PHP after the end bracket. We should have put this up here. But now it thinks that this HTML down here is actually PHP, so we have to exit PHP again, and we do that like this. And then we can hit save and we'll refresh. But why did it work before? Well, what if we were to remove all of this stuff, all of this HTML, hit save, go over here and refresh the page? Everything still looks exactly the same, and if we go into the inspector, we can see that it's actually the exact same code as before. So why is that? Well, your browser is always going to try and generate the code that it feels like is missing. So this is just because it's standard. This code should be there, and so the browser just generates it for us. So that's the reason for that. But that also means that as long as we're just fooling around with some PHP and trying to get things to work, figure out how things works, we don't need to put everything in there. We can get back to how we put the proper HTML structure into our documents once we do the separation of concerns later on. What we do is we want to turn on error handling. Now, this is going to allow PHP to display inside the browser what goes wrong whenever something does go wrong. And trust me, things are going to go wrong, especially when you're learning something new. And even for me, as a seasoned developer, I always have this turned on because otherwise I won't have a real chance to fix my mistakes whenever I make them. And I'm going to make mistakes throughout this video, and I'm not going to hide that because I want to use that as a learning opportunity to show you how I work with these errors as they occur. And now error handling might already be turned on inside of your php.ini file on your computer, but just to avoid playing around with settings and finding those files and all those things, let's just turn it on directly here inside of our PHP document. So we'll remove the remainders of the HTML. I can mark up all of the text that I have in here and hit Shift Tab to remove the indentation. And then as the first thing, I'll want to write error reporting, and then in parentheses, all. And the next thing I want to do is I want to say ini set, so that's going to change the parameter of the php.ini file. And inside of that, I can write the key and the value. And the key is going to be display underscore errors. And the value is going to be 1. So yes, I want to display errors. And when I hit save, now I know that whatever errors show up are going to be shown directly in the browser. Now, one little thing to remember when you're doing this is this needs to be the first code. Because if an error happens in your PHP document as it runs before it gets to this point, then it doesn't know that you want to actually see these errors. And of course, when you're done with your system and you want to put it on a server somewhere and you want people to start using it, you'll remove these lines, or you'll make a configuration to not include those lines because you don't want errors to show to other people. That's something that's specific to you as a developer that you want to see. Now, it's getting kind of annoying that it just says hello world right here. We want it to say hello and then the name of our user. So the first thing we want to do to get that to work is we want some kind of a variable with the user's name, right? So let's create our first variable. In PHP, you denote variables with a $sign. So I'll say $name and then equals, and my name is Henrik. So I'll put that in here, and then I can use that name later on because it's a variable. So right now I can do two different things. I can remove the word from here, and then I can make a space and a dot and then say $name. I'll hit save, and when I go over here and I hit refresh, I'll just close this down, hit refresh. Now it says hello Henrik. So the name now comes from a variable. Now we can do this a little bit differently. We can replace these single quotes with double quotes. And if we do that, then we can actually include the variable directly inside the string. So once again, if I hit, I'll actually change the name just to Henry, just so you can see when I refresh that something's different, and it still says hello Henry. But this only works when we're doing double quotes. So if I change this back to single quotes, you can even see now that the color changed because our syntax highlighting inside of Visual Studio Code is helping us out here. And now it just says hello $name. So it takes it as a literal thing, what we wrote in here when we use single quotes, instead of with double quotes, where it uses what's called string interpolation. Right now, we just expect that this name is going to be the name of everyone. So it's still kind of static, right? So let's make a form where people can actually insert their names. So I'll make a form, I'll end that form, and inside that form, I'm going to make an input, and I'm going to make a another input. And number 2 is going to be of the type submit. The first is going to be of the type text. I should probably make labels for these just so you can see what it is. Label for equals name, because we want the name to be in the first one. And then on the submit button, that's actually just going to say submit by default. So if we save this, we should probably make a line break here as well. So we save it, and I hit refresh over here. We actually can't see the label. That's because I don't have an end tag for it. And I don't have any text in it either. So here it says name, and I hit refresh. So name, and now we have an input field for it here. Now, I can write here that my name is Jack. It isn't, but I could, and say submit. And you can actually see a question mark up here. But other than that, nothing changes. The question mark up here means that we just made what's called a GET request, an HTTP GET request. There's a bunch of different methods that you can use in HTTP to make a call towards the server, because that's what we're doing with a form. The form exists on our client computer, but it sends some data back to the server. And that's what we're doing in this case with a GET request. So if I were to remove this and just go back, I haven't made a request now, I'm just visiting the URL, but if I hit submit, it shows back up. So I'm visiting again, and now I'm going into the form, and I'm saying the method should be post. And if I hit save, and I go over here, I hit refresh, I have to do that because this needs to also change in the browser. And I hit submit, now I can see that the URL is not changing. And that's because in a GET request, whatever you're sending as parameters is going to be part of your URL by default. And when you're doing a post request, whatever you're sending along as parameters is going to be in the body of your HTTP request. So it's not really placed in the same place in the whole HTTP setup, and that's why you're not seeing that question mark right now. So that also means that the default attribute for the form method is going to be post. I could also say here action to define the URL where I want these calls to go. I could say index.php, and if I hit save, go over here, hit refresh, it's actually warning me because I just posted something. And when I refresh after posting something, it thinks that I'm going to post it again, or it is going to post it again. So that's why it's warning me right now. But I'll just hit continue because I'm not doing anything with this data anyway. So I'll just go to the URL and I'll hit submit again. And you can see now it actually says index.php. I could just remove this and say /, hit save, hit refresh. Actually, let me just remove everything here again. And when I hit submit, it's going to be exactly where it was. But you might have noticed that nothing really changed here. So method is get by default. So if we want to use a get method, then we don't have to have the method attribute at all. If we want to send our data to the same URL that we're already at, then we don't need the action attribute because that's the default value of the action attribute. So I'll save this, and it doesn't make a lot of difference. Now, inside PHP, we'll want to catch this name, right? So if I write Jack, I'll want it to say, hello, Jack, down here. So how can we do that? Well, this is the input field that we're typing the text in. This input field up here is the one that we made with this input here. So we need to give that a name. And I'll say that the name is going to be name. And the reason that we need the name attribute is that the name attribute defines how the variable is going to look at the other end when we get into the PHP. So now that we have this name up here, I can use what's in PHP called a super global array named get. So it looks like this, $_ We have this underscore before the super global arrays, and these are the super global arrays that exist in PHP. And we're looking for the one that's called get because we're not using post right now. So get, and then in square brackets and quotation marks, doesn't matter if it's single or double, we'll write name. And the reason we're writing name is because that's the name that we gave it in the name attribute in our HTML. So this is going to give us the name. Now, obviously, we're not doing anything with it right now, but we could replace the name down here with this to say, this is now the name that we're working with. And of course, we had to use double quotation marks down here in order to use string interpolation. So I'll hit save here. And now when I hit submit, it's going to give us a warning. Okay, and the reason it gives us this warning is that we didn't refresh first. So even though all of this would work because we're posting to the new version of the HTML, this only comes in after the page is reloaded. It was trying to use the old version of the form because I didn't hit refresh. So I can actually just click in the address bar, hit enter, and write that name again, and everything is going to work. So there wasn't a real error that right there. I just hadn't refreshed before I posted anything. And now it says, hello, Jack. And I can say, hello, Joe, and all of the names that I want in the whole wide world. So now we actually have a form where we can send something that we can then receive inside of PHP. And we have a string that actually changes with the input. Now, if we're going to build Twitter, it's not enough that people just type in their name and then we allow that to be their real name, right? You can even see up here, like I mentioned before, that when we're using the GET request, we have the variables as part of the URL. So we don't want people to just write some name up here and then that's their name. So let's start taking baby steps towards a login system. And the first thing we're going to do is we need to make sure that there are some usernames. And for now, we're just going to put those usernames in a variable. We're going to put them in a database in a moment, but we'll need to work with arrays anyways. So let's create an array here of usernames. And we can make an array in two different ways. We can say array, parenthesis, and a semicolon, and then we can say Jack, Joe, and Jill. We could do the exact same thing by saying usernames equals, and then a square parenthesis or with a semicolon after it, and then the content of that would be exactly the same. These two lines do exactly the same thing, and there's not even anything wrong with having them after each other because it's just going to assign this array to the variable first, then it's going to assign this array to that variable afterwards, so it's not really going to change anything. But we don't need both of these, so I'll just go with the second syntax for now. It doesn't really matter. I just want to show you that if you figure out later in your script that you want to add something to this array, how do you do that? I want to add the username Jane. So username, square parenthesis, and then an equal sign. Then after that, I can just say Jane, and now Jane is part of this array. But how do I know? How can I see this array? Well, I can say print_r. That's a special function in PHP that's made to look at the contents of an array. So in here I can write $usernames, hit save, and now when I go to this URL, it actually shows me that there is an array right here. Now, this can be a little bit difficult to look at. So this is where we need to figure out how to work with things between HTML and PHP, because it's actually HTML that's limiting how this looks. So if we were to go up here and say, now I don't want to be in PHP anymore. I'm just writing some HTML, and HTML has an element that's called pre. So now we're making a pre element. So that means pre-formatted. That means that it's going to accept all of the white spaces and line breaks that exist inside of it. And it of course needs to end again. And then after it ends, we're going back into PHP. But this is also PHP, so we also need to write PHP here and exit out of PHP. So this is a little bit of jumping in and out of PHP, and we could of course just echo this as a string. Doesn't really matter. But I generally feel it's the best practice to jump out of PHP when you're writing HTML instead of having HTML in quoted strings and echoing them. So we'll save this, and I'll go over here and I'll hit refresh, and you can see it's the exact same data, but it's pre-formatted. So it's much easier to read. And you can also see that we have all these three names at first, but then we added the name Jane. Is we want to make sure that people are actually only allowed access if they have a name that exists within our usernames array. So we'll use an if-else statement to do that. It works like this. If something happens, then curly brackets, and else, then curly brackets, what happens if whatever we write in here is not true. So if it's true, then this happens. If it's false, then this happens. So if it's true, we'll still want it to say hello and then the name. If it's not true, then we want it to say echo there's no user named and then the name that they typed in. So what's going to be the condition? The condition is going to use, well, actually, let's make this really simple at first. Let's just say if the name equals double equals sign and then quotation marks Jack. We'll hit save, and now we can say Joe, hit submit. There's no user named Joe, but Jack, well, there is a user named Jack. So that's why we're getting hello Jack. That's great, but that doesn't work with the whole array. So we'll have to use a function for that. So there's a lot of built-in functions in PHP. One of them is called inArray. And what we do with this inArray is we say the name is the name, which is called the needle in PHP documentation, in the haystack, so that's going to be the array, usernames. And I'll hit save. So now if the name that we're typing in is in this array, it's going to say hello to us, and otherwise it's going to have a problem with it. So now we can say Joe, hello Joe. We can say Jill, it'll say hello Jill, and we can say mom, and it's going to say there's no user named mom. So we have a login system now. It's terrible, but it's there. Now I'm going to create my own function instead of this inArray, and then I'm going to use that instead. So I'll call it function username exists parenthesis and then curly brackets. Inside the parenthesis, I could write a parameter. Actually, I'm going to. So let's take a number or a name. And then this function is going to figure out whether that username exists. Now, there's a reason why we're doing this, and this is because we want to match with passwords as well in a moment. So let's just use a function to overwrite this into something that we can change afterwards. So if username exists, then what we're going to do inside of this function is we're going to create a loop. So we're going to say for each usernames as username. So that means that it's going to take each of these usernames inside of that array, and it's going to assign that to a variable called username. So I can say, so inside of this, I can say if name equals username, not usernames with an S because that's plural for the array, but singular without the S because that's the single username that we're looking at. Then I'm going to return true. And if we go through the whole array without ever finding a match, then we'll return false, semicolon. So I'm going to replace this now with our function that's called username exists. And we only have to give it the name. So I'll go over here and I'm going to write mom, hit enter, and we have an error. So what does it say? Undefined variable usernames. So right here, it cannot find a variable that's called usernames. So that's because of the scope. Now, the simple solution to this is just to move the usernames down into this function, because we don't really need it anywhere else anyway. So let's just do the simple version. We don't need to print it out anymore. We don't need to add this afterwards. We might as well just add it directly here and remove that line. So then it's only this single line of code that we need to add into the function. So we hit save. I'll go over here and I'll hit refresh, and it'll say there's no user named mom. What about Jack? Well, hello Jack. Perfect. So this still works. Because the next thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that people actually have the right password. And in PHP, everything in an array already has a key and a value. So all of these are assigned to values where the 0, the 1, the 2, and the 3 was the key. So I could find each of these variables by using that number, by saying usernames. And then, so if I were to say usernames square parenthesis 1, if I were to echo that, then it would print out the name Joe. Because if I said 0, it would be Jack. And if I said 2, it would be Jill. But we can change that. We can actually use this instead of the 0. So instead of saying that whenever I say 0, I want the value to be Jack, I can say whenever I say Jack, I want the value to be some form of a password. And I do that with an arrow like this. So now I'm going to say password. And since we're going to have more data now, I'll need to write this in a more readable way. And I'm actually just going to give everyone the same password here just to make things a little bit easier. And then, of course, no comma after the last one. And we need to remember the semicolon when we're done. But this also means that this for each loop is not going to work anymore, because this is going to reference, it's still going to go through all of these, but it's going to look for someone named password. Actually, let's just try that out. So if I go up here and I just refresh the page, it's going to say there's no username Jack. Remember, when we refresh, it's just going to use the parameters that we already sent. But if I say my name is password, then it says hello password. So it thinks all the users are named password right now. That's no good, but that's because we're looking at the values, and the usernames are keys now, which is actually fine because we don't want two users with the same username anyway, but we don't care if we have the same password for several different users. So what we can do here is we're going to say username and then the same arrow to password. So now we're defining that we have a key and a value. And this is actually enough to make this thing work again. So I'm saving, I'm hitting refresh. There's no username password, but there is one named Joe. So we can see that it works again. But this also means that we now have the password available. So inside of here, we could write out, just to make things easy, echo name has the password. Save, I'll hit refresh, and it says Joe has the password. Hello, Joe. Okay, So we actually have access to both the username and the password now. So that also means that we could make our condition here better. So we could say that we're going to change this function now to say username password. And then we're going to send it a name and a password. And then down here in our condition, we're going to say if the name equals the username and the password equals the password. That's going to be a bit problematic because we both named a variable here and one here password. So let's just call it passcode up here just to differentiate them and make things easier. And then say that the passcode is going to be the same as the password. Let me just make this a little bit wider so you can see all of the code. Save. I'll go up here and I'll hit refresh, and it's going to say call to undefined function username exists because I didn't rename the function up here. So I'll copy it here, paste it here, but it's still going to give us an error because right now we're only giving it a name, but it wants a name and a password. So I'll say comma up here and I'll have to give it a password. The simple solution would of course be to give it just the word password. I'll hit save here, go back and hit refresh. And now, since we're still posting Joe, you can see that here, Joe has the password. That's fine. But we don't want to just hard code. That's called hard coding, the password. We'll want to have another field here in our form that's called password. So let's make a line break and then copy what we did for the name and just say that this is going to be a label for the password. It's going to say password, and the type of this field is going to be password, and the name of the field is also going to be password. So that's just the same word 4 times here. So once we have that, we can go down here, we can assign it to a variable and say that the variable password is going to get the password from the get array because we're using a get method in our form. So I'll go over here and I'll hit refresh, and now we can see that we can type in both a name and a password. And we have an undefined key password down here in line 25. Let's look at line 25. Well, that's because right now we're assuming that there is a password, but there might not be. And that's actually a little bit problematic because if we were to remove everything from up here, it just expects us to have a username and a password, but there might not be any. So we should actually do something about that. But just for now, to finish our train of thought, let's say that we have Joe and that we have the password. I'll hit submit and Joe has the password. And actually, I'm not even using the password right now. So now we're going to be using the actual password that's typed in here. Now, if we want to change this, we can do that directly here. We can say the type password is the type text and see the password that's actually typed in here. So Joe and passcode. Now it's going to say that Joe has that has the password. But why is it actually doing that? Because we're looking for something that has the right username and the password. And by now we should be getting everything through. By the way, I'm sorry that it keeps forming everything up here. But it says name, password. So it has the name here, so we can access it. We're accessing it here, and it's spelled the same way. Our syntax highlighting tells us that. we're passing the name and the password that we got from here. And when it receives that, it's going to call the passcode. So it's going to look for something that has a username and a passcode that's accurate before it returns true. So if I were to write Jill and then just 1, 2, 3, 4, it shouldn't actually do this. And that's because we have a single equation mark here. So right now what we're doing is we're actually assigning the password to the passcode instead of comparing. So the password would always be accurate because it's being assigned. We need a second equation mark here. So let's hit save. Let's go over here and refresh. And now it says there's no username Jill. But if we say Jill and then we use the password, and once again, we can change the type to text up here if we want to see what we're writing, and then hit submit. Then it says Jill has the password. So there was a bit of error handling, and this was an error that PHP couldn't actually print out on the screen because it wasn't technically wrong what we were doing. We were just assigning a variable instead of comparing to it. But now we're also actually checking if the user exists and if it has the right password. So we're getting closer to having a real login system. Now I did say in the beginning of the video that this error reporting should be the first thing. So I'm actually going to move it up here to be the first thing. And I'm primarily doing that because I want to add something that should also be very early in the document. It should come right after this or right before it even. No, it should be right after because then you can still see the error message. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a session, but I'll only want to create a session if there isn't already one. And I'm just going to do it and then I'll explain how this works. So if session status equals two of them, PHP underscore session underscore none, then session start. So we're using a couple of built-in things here. We're using a built-in function called session status that's going to return the status of the current session. And we're going to use a function called session start that's going to start a new session. And this PHP session none is a built-in constant that is one of the variables that can be returned by this function. So what we're really saying here is if there isn't a session already, then start one. So why is it important to check if there already is one? Well, the way that a session works is, generally speaking, whenever you visit a website, your browser is going to say hello to the server, and the server is just going to give you some arbitrary number to remember who it's talking to. So it's just going to say, hello 316, how can I help you? And then it's going to use that number 316 to remember everything that was going on in your conversation. But another user might visit the website at the same time. So they'll just get number 420. And that way the server can differentiate between the conversations that it's having with different clients or with different users. So that's the point of sessions. And we'll want a session so we can remember that people are already logged in, because otherwise they'll have to send their username and their password into us with every single request. And we obviously don't want that. So for that reason, we're starting a session. But why are we checking if there already is one? Well, this is going to assign that number. So if we start a session with someone who already has a session, we're giving them a new session number. So that means we're actually forgetting everything that was already in the session. We're forgetting the contents of our conversation. So now that we have this, we can actually go out here and we can hit refresh. And the page is generally the same, but if we click up here, you can see here in cookies that there is now a cookie called PHP says ID, and it has this content, which is this general gibberish, right? So this session ID is what's going to separate us from a different user. So if I were to open a different browser, actually I can just open an incognito window and then go to the same window here and say localhost 8080. Then I can do the same thing. Click here, look at my cookies, localhost cookies PHP says ID, and I have a different session ID over here. So that means that we're capable of having two different conversations here. Now, let's work with this just a little bit, just to show you how it works. And actually, by the way, we still have these error messages that we haven't done anything about yet. We'll get to that, I promise. But right now, let's change this username password function once again to be an actual login function. So login. Hit save. And then down here, let's change this echo to say logged in as, and then the name. We don't want to print out the password anymore. We know that that part works. But after we do that, before we return true, we'll want to use these super globals once again and say session logged in, or whatever you want to call it, equals true. And then in our session, now we can remember that people are logged in. We can also say session username equals actually the name, because that's going to be the username. So we're now using the session to remember what name they typed in whenever they're not typing it in again. So I'll hit save back here, and let's just try this out, right? Mom, there's no user called mom. What about Jill? Password, save, logged in as Jill. Hello, Jill. Okay, so far so good, but we're not really using this for anything, right? So let's say that all of this stuff right here, we're only going to do this if we're not logged in already, right? So if is set, so that's just used to check if a variable already exists, because that can be a bit difficult to figure out sometimes in PHP. So if is set session logged in and session logged in equals true, then we want to do something. And what is it that we want to do? Well, it's basically all of this, isn't it? Well, this is a function, so it doesn't matter if that's inside of it or not, but it basically goes down to all the way down to here. So we should move everything else out just one step, just to show the proper indentation here. And one thing that we might want to do when we're jumping in and out of PHP like this is that we could write a colon here instead, and then remove these brackets and say end if. Then at least we know that there's an if statement that ends down here. So I'll hit save up here, and when I go out here and I refresh, it has a problem here. It says cannot use is set on the result of an expression. Right, so we have to end the is set function right here. Is set the variable, and then the variable is also true. So hit save, hit refresh, go over here, and then in close, we still have an error. This is on line 10, that it says this square bracket, it's actually syntax highlighted to be problematic as well. So let's fix that, hit save and hit refresh. And now it says logged in as Jill and all that stuff. But since we're logged in as Jill, well, this happens. So if we're logged in, we'll just want to echo logged in, semicolon. Actually, we can say logged in as, and then session username, because we set that before, right? Semicolon, and then we can say else colon. So now we have, if we're logged in, we just get this line of code, else we're gonna get all of this. So save, go over here, hit refresh, and we have another syntax error in line 12. And that's because it's not really happy about us using an array with interpolation. So let's just remove that and say dot, hit refresh, and it just says logged in as Jill. But if I go over into the private browser here and I refresh over here, we're not logged in. So this is definitely not the same page. There's actually a huge difference right now because one is logged in and the other one isn't. And that's the session that makes that difference. So let's go over here and say Joe and then password, hit submit. And now we're logged in as Joe. And if I refresh this page, it just says logged in as Joe and logged in as Jill. So I can refresh all the times that I want, but I'm going to get different results because the sessions are remembering different things between these two browser instances. Now, this is also because that's how private browsers work in Chrome. If we just copy the URL right here and just open a new tab, punch it in, then we're still logged in as Jill. But if we open a different browser or a private browser, then there's going to be enough of a difference that we can have separate cookies, and the cookies are what hold our session IDs. So that's why we can have these different conversations with the server. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to make it possible to create new users, right? It's not really that great that all of our users are just hard-coded into the system. We want to make a registration form where people can sign up to use our system. But we have a problem, because if we just say that whenever people use the registration form, then we add something to the array, it's only going to be added to the array for that run through of the code. See, the PHP server, it just starts with the first line of code in the file that you selected, and then it goes from start to finish. And once it's done, it forgets everything. So you can create all of the data and all of the variables that you want, but it's just going to be forgotten. Unless, of course, you're using a session, but a session is specific to a single user. Another user will not be able to get that. So that also means that if we were using sessions to remember all the possible usernames and passwords, well, we could do that, but then you'd only ever be able to log in when you're in the same browser using that same session. And even in the same browser on the same computer, your session is going to run out eventually, and you'll have to log back in, which you can't because your user only exists in a session. So we need permanent storage that goes across sessions. We basically need to store something on the server, right? And for that, we'll need a database. Now, we have a whole database course, of course, available on the channel, but let's just jump right into it. We're going to create a database connection, but we're going to do it in a different file because this is starting to be a bit much, right? So let's just create a new file here, call it database.php. And since we only have the database installed, I don't know what kind of tools you might have installed. So we're just going to do everything straight from PHP here, right? So I'll jump into PHP in this file, and I'll make a new database connection. Now, there's a couple of different ways to connect to databases in PHP, but we're going to use PDO. So I'll say here, connection, or just con for short, equals new PDO. And in here, we need what's called a connection string. So if it's MySQL or MariaDB, then we say MySQL :host equals, and then we need some variable with a host in it. Then after that string, we're going to need the username and the password. Normally, we would also need the name of the database, but since we haven't created the database yet, we'll connect to the general database management system instead of a specific database. Then we'll connect to the specific database once we created it. So I'll hit save here. And then on that connection, I want to set an attribute. Here, I want to say that we want PDO attribute error mode. And we'll want PDO error mode exception. So that generally just means that we want to know about it if anything goes wrong. Now, in order to actually see these, we need to use a try catch. So let's say try and catch. So that means that if anything goes wrong, anywhere in this try statement, then it's going to jump down into the catch statement and start doing things down here. But if nothing goes wrong, then it's just going to skip the catch statement. And you could actually say finally, if you wanted to have something that's always going to happen afterwards, no matter if it fails somewhere along the way. But of course, that's more of a structural thing, because afterwards it's going to jump down to whatever code comes after it. But in here, we can define what kind of exception it is we're looking for. So we can say PDO exception, $E, then whatever error message comes from this PDO exception, if it were to happen, is going to be inserted inside of this variable E, or error, we could call it. And then we can just say echo connection to database failed, :space, and then the error. So now if we cannot connect to the database, it's going to show us an error. I'm saving this, and right now let's just go directly to this file. It's called database.php, so we can just say localhost 8080/database.php. And we have a bunch of errors. Of course, we're using 3 different variables here that we haven't set. So we're going to need a host, we're going to need a username, and we're going to need a password. And a little bit later on, we're also going to need a actual database. But we can actually just terminate a variable like this. Now we've just defined it, but we haven't given it any value. That doesn't matter because we're not using it anywhere. So this is okay. And then the host is going to be localhost. No port number or anything. This is not our PHP installation we're pointing to. This is our database installation. The username is most likely going to be root, but you might have defined something else. And you might have defined a password as well. And if you don't remember that password, go over to those installation videos on how you install PHP and MySQL on Windows and Mac. It'll show you how to change the password. At least the one for the Mac does. But by default, it's either empty or root. So let's save this and try and refresh this page. And now you can see nothing is actually being written here. So if we say echo down here, connection established, hit save, hit refresh, then you can see that the connection is established because we get down to this point without having an error first. Otherwise, we would have gotten down here. So that also means that we can now write out things, and we can use some of the things that we've learned already. So let's write a little bit of SQL here. We can write show databases, semicolon, and then we'll want to run that SQL code somehow. So we'll need to use a prepared statement, which is good practice anyway. So statement, STMT, just for short, because we're going to write this a lot of times. Generally, you'll want to use variable names that make sense and are full words, but there are some words that it's just general practice to shorten because you use them so much. So statement equals connection, prepare, SQL, semicolon. Then we're going to say statement execute, because we want to run the code. But since we're actually trying to get something out of it, we'll want to get some results. So results equals statement fetch all, parenthesis, and semicolon. And then we want to print the result out on the screen, and we can use that using print R that we saw before. So results, semicolon, and you might remember that it looks a whole lot prettier if we put it inside of a pre-element. That makes it much easier to read. So into PHP, out of PHP, save, and let's hit refresh. And now you can see that we're actually getting some data out here. Now, this is easier to read than if we hadn't said pre, but let's be honest, this could be even easier. So let's do something really quick here. Let's make a table instead that just shows us whatever it is that we are getting out. Or actually, let's not. We have a tool available that you can download that does all of this. I'll link it in the description. So go use that if you want to just get things in and out of your database. For now, we want to create a database. So I'll say create database. I'll call it Twitter. So I'm creating something now. That means that there's not going to be a result down here. One way that we could work with this, if we want this code to just always work, is we could use that try catch again to just say try and do this. If it doesn't work, then catch something. And if we don't know what we're going to catch, we can just go for a general exception. Say if there is a general exception, then catch that. And if we don't even care that this is happening, then we can just not do anything here. So a try catch doesn't work if you don't have either a catch or a finally after it. You cannot just say try something and then not care if it works. So that's why I'm doing this. I'm not really doing anything about it, but I am using the correct structure. And actually, there won't be any results to show. So this should be part of it as well. I need to end this this catch down here. So I'll hit save and I'll hit refresh. And I expect now that a database was created. But let me say show databases, hit save, hit refresh. And it's actually not doing this. I don't know exactly why, but I also don't really care right now. So let's just save this, hit refresh, and let's see here if we have a database that's called Twitter. We do. Database Twitter. So that also means that we can now assign this variable up here, Twitter, hit save, and then we can add that to our connection string to say that we have a host, and then inside this string, this is the connection string. The rest is just credentials. So in here we can add a semicolon, and then we can say DB name equals, and then database. So the orange things here, they need to be exactly as they're written here, but the blue things are our variable names that we could name differently. We could have called the variable DB name if we wanted it to be more like the connection string, but that's fine. We'll hit save here, and we'll hit refresh. And when we hit refresh, we can see that the connection is still established. So that means that we didn't break the connection by adding the database to it. So now we actually have a database. We can work with this a little bit more to say show tables, save, hit refresh, and we can see that there are no tables. So we can create one. SQL equals create table user. And I generally try to use singular case when we do stuff like this. So he'll say that a user has a user ID, which is going to be a serial, and it's going to be a primary key. Then they have a email, and it's just a general UX thing that you'll want to use people's email addresses for sign in instead of some arbitrary username that they're going to forget. So they'll have an email, and we can save that in a varchar. So that's a series of characters of variable length, but with a maximum length of, let's say, 126 characters. And then and by the way, this needs to be unique. We don't want two users with the same username, and it needs to be not null. Then we'll want a password. That's going to be varchar 126 as well. but we don't care if that's unique or anything, but it shouldn't be null. So that's the three things that a user has. Then we need to prepare the statement and execute it, and then we're going to show the tables again afterwards. So save this, hit refresh, and then it does it, and then it shows us everything afterwards. So now we actually have tables in Twitter, well, user, and we can, now that this is done, we shouldn't run it again. So I'll just comment it out so it's not disappearing from your screens quite yet, but I'll delete it in a moment. And then we'll say describe Twitter. Hit save. Oh, sorry, we're already inside Twitter. So describe user, that's what I wanted to do. Hit refresh, and then it's going to tell us about these three fields. The first one is going to be a user ID. Next one's going to be email. The last one's going to be password. And what are the different conditions for working with these things. Obviously, this is much easier to get an overview of if you're using a tool for it. But I don't think we necessarily need that just yet. So we have the connection, and there's actually only a couple of things that we want to change. First of all, we don't want to echo that something works. If it works, it's fine. If it doesn't work, then we can print out the error message. We don't want to create the table again. That's already been done. And we don't want to actually describe anything or print anything out. We just want the connection. Now, there is something with variables that's called scope. So this connection variable is not going to be available anywhere outside of this try block right here. So we'll say connection here, $ con, semicolon. So like I said before, we can just define that there is a variable. Now down here, we assign something to it, but that means that it still exists in a global scope. So if I save this, I can now jump over into my index file and I can say, we only need the database actually if people are not logged in already, but we might need it for other things. So maybe we'll just say up here, require once, and then database.php. That needs to be in quotation marks because it's the name of a file. And then of course a semicolon. So require once, PHP. And once we have that, we can start working with the database inside here. So let me just quickly walk you through that require once. There's generally 4 different ways of adding one file to another. There's require, and there's require once, and then there's include and include once. The difference is, if you say include, then it's going to try and include the file, but if it can't find it, it'll just keep going as if nothing happens. If you say require, and it cannot find the file, then it's going to break. It's going to stop the application. It's not going to try to run any more code. That's the difference between include and require. And then there's the word once, which just means that you should only include this if you haven't done so already. So if I'm trying to require the database once and then I write that line twice, that's fine. This works, but it only runs it one time. When it gets to the second one here, it says, well, I already did that just before, so I'm not going to do it again. So we have the database available to us now, and we can actually go ahead and create our registration form. Since we're cleaning up already, let's do a little bit more of this cleaning up and see how easy we can make it to actually read this code, because we have way too many things going on inside the same file right here. So let's create a file here called loginform.php. And take all of this code that makes the form for logging in and just put it inside that login form. We can then fix the indentation, hit save, go back into index and say include once login form.php semicolon. And of course, this is not HTML, so we need to just remove that part that jumps in and out of PHP. Then we can take all of this functionality here that that lets us log in, and we can put that into another file called login function.php. And we can take it from here. So that's this code right here, login function. We need to jump into PHP before we can do that. and we have it here, fixed indentation. And if I go back here, I can see this function right here is only being called from this code anyway. So that might as well be in here as well. That's going to keep things a little bit more clean. So now when we're inside of our file here, this is much easier to read, and it has a more specific goal, right? This is just the file, our index file is right now just setting everything up for us, right? It tells us we need some error handling. We want to see errors. We want a session. We want a database. And if you're logged in, then you get to see some text here. If you're not logged in, then you get to go to the login form. Let's add this to a separate file as well, because we're going to start adding things to what you can see when you're logged in soon enough. So I'll say include once logged in.php, semicolon, and then I'll create that file, logged in.php, and jump into PHP in that file to do the same thing. Now, this actually doesn't need to be PHP. It can just say logged in as, and then have this variable. Now, there is a shortcut for this, PHP, and then echo. This code right here is something that you'll want to write so frequently that there's a shortcut for it built right into PHP. So you can remove the word PHP and you can remove the word echo and replace all of that with an equals sign. You can also remove the semicolon after it and then just have it written like this. So that's going to be really simple when you have some simple HTML text where you just need to print out some variables into it. This is the way to do that. So this code does exactly the same as the code that we had before. And that also means that we can now create a logout button, because until now we haven't actually been able to log back out. Not in any easy way anyways. So let's just create a line break or two, and then hyperlink with reference to a logout.php, the text logout, and there we go. So this is going to create a link when we are logged in. Then we have this link to the logout, but the logout.php doesn't exist. So logout.php, create that. And in here, we'll want to make sure that we're working with the same session, because this is going to be called on its own. So let's copy this and then say logged out, jump into PHP, and session destroy. Actually, we can just say session unset. Save and hit refresh. Now, if we go to that page, let's just write, you're now logged out. And we can click here and it says you're now logged out. And if we go back, now we have the login form again. If we say Jill password, Jill password. Oh, we actually have an error here. This is why it's so important to keep testing your things as you're building it, because we do have the login form, but the login form right now is pointing to itself. So it's pointing to the index file because that's where it's required from. But this doesn't know anything about the login function. So what we'll want to do here is the login form should point to the action login function.php. There we go. And the login function could then write, well, it actually says hello and all those things. You are now logged in. There we go. So this, we need to refresh now, because if we look in the inspector, we can see that the form doesn't have any action on it yet. So if we just hit refresh, now it has the action that we set on it. And we can write Jill password, hit submit. Forget all these things. No. Logged in is Jill. Hello, Jill. You're now logged in. That's all great. And if I refresh the page, or if I just remove everything from after here, we get out to this new page, but that's because we don't have the actual session available in here. So let's just copy this again. Now we're getting a bit of duplicate code here, and we'll fix that later on. But inside of the login function, we'll need to have this session available as well. I don't know why it's not copying it. Login function, paste, save, go, and then Jill password. No, I know it's a terrible password. Stop asking me. But I am logged in now, and if I go back to the base URL, I'm logged in as Jill. I can log out, and I'm now logged out. Now, it's of course annoying that we need to write all of these URLs. So let's just do a little bit of redirection here to say you're now logged out. Yeah, that's fine. I just want to go back to the front page. So I'll make a header here, and I'll add a string where it says location, colon, and then / index.php. And I'm copying it, and then I'm removing the text right here, and I'm actually also removing the ending of the PHP. And then I'm doing the same on the login function down here. So if you're logged in, you might as well go to this page, but that also means that we shouldn't echo this. And I'm also removing this because you cannot really use a header to redirect someone after you've written text on the screen, because then that text is not going to be visible to the end user. So if I say log out now, then it's actually going to go to the index page. And if I use a wrong username and password, something that doesn't exist, enter, it's going to say there is no user named all of this stuff. But if I say Jill and then password, submit, then it's going to say that I'm logged in as Jill. And I want to avoid having this duplicate code and these different addresses and things like that. So I'll want to in here just say, well, if you're already logged in, that's fine. You get the logged in page. If you're not, then let's just check if you're trying to log in. So if login, then you should still get the logged in page. And else, you'll get the login form. That means that now in the login form, we don't have to have this action anymore. We can actually use the index page for logging in, or for the login function, because it's now included. Well, it is in a moment. Require once login function.php semicolon. So we need that in order to call this function that we created. That's called login. Now in the login function, we have all of this stuff that actually comes before the function. But now since it's being called from the index file, we don't need this. That was duplicate code anyway. This was already commented out. And now that we're at the same page, we don't need to redirect to that page. So basically we only need this login function, but this login function doesn't have the username and the password. So it's getting that from here. We'll just add it directly to the function. That also means that it doesn't have to take any parameters anymore. But of course we need to call it passcode down here because we had that discrepancy where we had passwords and two different variables. So all of this is unnecessary. We just have a function in here now that's called login, which is great. And let's just see if it works, right? Log out. Undefined array key name in login function line 4. Login function line 4. Oh, right. So this is the problem, right? That we're not actually trying to log in. So we already know how to fix that. We'll just try. And if this doesn't work, catch exception error, return false. So if this doesn't work, then we're not logging in. Simple. So refresh. Oh, that's not enough actually. So undefined array key name. So I guess we'll have to do something else then. So let's say if is set, this one, and then just do that instead. And then this just becomes an else. So let's try again. So now everything is fine. It's only trying to log in if we have any variables to actually use for it. So this random thing that it's trying to add in here doesn't work. But if we say, once again, a JAX and a password, then we're logged in as JAX. And we can say log out. Then for the login form, we changed all of that. So we're logging in, we're logging out, and everything works. And the great thing here is that this now becomes like a controller. So when we move into MVC in a moment, this is like a controller that just defines everything that's going to happen. What's the functionality? What am I going to see? That's what a controller generally does. So this is a good separation of concerns. So we'll want to create a registration form so that people can actually create some users that they can log in with, right? So if we go into the login form, we'll add a link under it that says user underscore creates or register PHP, and then we'll add that, and then we'll say register new user. So now when we have this form, we can also click on register new user. And of course we need to create this file, user register.php, user underscore register.php. And in here we need to have a form so we can copy the whole, we can actually copy the whole thing here and then just change the things that we wanted to change. So first of all, we'll want to say that this is a link back to the index file, where we say already have an account. So if we clicked here by mistake, we can get back to the index page. And remember, this is the index page, even though it's pulling in the login form. That's just a requirement from the index page because of the situation that we're in right now. Then we have this form up here, and actually we just need a username and an email address and a password. So so actually let's change this word email, name to email. Or let's say that our users have a name and an email. We can work with that. So you need a name and an email. So register has name, email, and password because we want to show the name. We don't want to show the email address. But that also means that we should do something here in the database to make sure that that's actually possible. So let's say SQL equals alter. The table was called user, add column, name, varchar 126, semicolon, and then we need to create a prepared statement from the connection, prepare the SQL, and then we need to take that statement and we need to execute it, and it's not going to return anything because it's just making that change. So I'll hit save, and then I can go into the database.php. It's a fatal error here. It's not accepting this. So it's saying that we have an error in the SQL syntax right near add column. We don't actually need the to say that. So let's try again. And now that we're not getting any error messages, that means that this worked. So once again, we can say describe user, and then we can go down here and we can say fetch all. And we can print it out. Results, and result equals this. So there we go. We can see now that there we go. So we can see now we have a user ID, an email, password, and a name in here. And I think this time we're just gonna use some code here to remove it, so we can easily go in here and change it if we need to do more changes to the database. So let's just remove all of this again and go back here, register a new user. So we need a user register. We also need a user register function, right? So user register function dot PHP. And then we'll have a function here called user register. And of course, we'll need to jump into PHP to do this. And then with this function, we're going to create that new user. So let's just take in all of the information here. We have a name equals get name, semicolon. Then we have a email, and then we have a password. That's great. So we'll save all of this, and then we'll want to add this to the database. So we'll say SQL equals insert into user, and then we'll add a parenthesis where we list what it is that we want to add. We want to add a name and an email and a password. This needs to be the names of the columns in the database. Then we'll say, I'll just go into a new line, values, and then a parenthesis where we list the same things, but with the values that we want to put into each of these columns. And I'll just say colon name. Actually, we could just say, we could just add these variables directly into the string. We'd have to use single quotes around them, but we could, but it would be a security risk. So let's just address our first security risk head on by saying colon name, colon email, and colon password. And then we hit semicolon. Just like before, we make our statements by saying connect, prepare the SQL. And this is the beauty of a prepared statement, that now it has prepared this SQL, but this is not valid because these are not values. But now we can bind parameters. So we can say statement bind param, and then say wherever it says colon name, what I really want is my name variable. So we'll copy that, and we'll do the same for the email and the password. save, go over here and hit refresh. And now if I say Jimmy, and my email address is going to be Jimmy, and my password is going to be password, just like everyone else. I'll hit submit. Let's see what happens. It goes to user register, but it doesn't go to user register function. So we haven't set in an action here to say user register function.php, save. So I'll go over here and I'll go to the to the form once again, and I'll say Jimmy, and by the way, I'm fully aware that Jimmy is not an email address, password, and we get to this blank page. So that probably means that we go in here and we get through all of this. So a couple of things, we're not actually executing anything here. So execute, statement, execute. There we go. And then just echo. Congratulations on registering. There we go. So save this, and then we can just refresh, and it's going to post the same thing from the form that we just did. And we're actually not getting this congratulations message. So I wonder what's going wrong. Now, I'm going to start using a database tool at this point because it becomes a bit cumbersome to just jump in here every time. And my database tool of choice is dbeaver. So I'm just going to jump into that. You can use PHP MyAdmin or any other tool that you want to. I'm not going to upgrade right now. I'm going to go into the database navigator, and then I'm going to create a new connection. I'm going to connect to a MariaDB server, localhost, port 3306. That's correct. Username, root, password, root for me. And so when I connect to that, I can see here that it needs to download some things. That we have our databases in here, and we have the Twitter database down here. And we have the table, user under it, and I can double click on it to see the properties for it, or here to see the data. So we can see that everything looks right structure-wise, but there's no data inside of this table. So let's figure out what's going wrong here. We're actually not calling this function ever. I think that's what's going on. We shouldn't be calling this at all. We should be calling the index.php or the / because that's the same thing. So then inside of the index, we can see if people are trying to create a user. So if they're not already logged in, they're not logging in, then down here, we can get them to the login form unless they're already trying to log in. This becomes a little bit muddy then, doesn't it? But we'll require once the user registration function.php, and then we'll say if they're logging in, then sure, they still get to the login page. Or what do we call the function in here? User register. So if they're logging in or they just registered, then they get this. So that also means that in this function, we need to return true or false. So here we'll return true, but this only works if we're actually getting something in here. And the name is the difference. We don't use the name when we're logging in. So if is set else return false. Save and refresh, and we get some errors now. Syntax error, register function on line 4. What does it say? Unexpected token, semicolon. Yeah, we don't have semicolons in the middle of if statements. So now something works again. And we should probably just call it user register. I don't think that's what we called it over here. User register. There we go. So let's just go back to scratch and say require once, failed to open stream. You can see now that it breaks because I'm using require instead of include, but that's fine. No such file, user registration function. Isn't that what the file is called? Rename, copy, index, paste. I might have misspelled something. Refresh. There we go. So I can still log in. Right, Jill, password, and I can log out, and I can register a new user called Jimmy, and password, submit, and we get an error message, undefined variable connection. So we cannot see the variable connection, and we can go into database and we can try and make this global, but that's not going to be enough. If we hit save, then there's still not going to be anything. But now that it is global, it's available here from the index file. So that means that we can go into user register, and then we can pass that connection as a parameter, and we can go down here and accept it as a parameter. That's going to allow us to use it. Now it's going to say that there's a different problem. There's an invalid parameter, and these are the parameters that we're binding, and I can see that I misspelled password. So let's save that, hit refresh, and now it says logged in as, and there's something here that's a little bit iffy because we're actually allowing you to see the page for people who are logged in because you just registered, but you're not actually logged in. So perhaps since we created the user, we should call the login function from the registration form if we want people to just get straight from the registration form directly into the to the user area for people who have accounts and are logged in. But we can't quite do that because right now we're between stages. We're logging in with these hard-coded values, but we're creating new users in the database. So let's see what dbeaver can show us here. If we hit refresh, then we can see that the user that we just created actually exists now. So they need to change the login function now to use these usernames and passwords that are registered instead of these hard-coded ones, right? So if we go into the login function here, we can see that we only have this array. And first of all, we're going to need the connection to do that. So let's just paste that in here as well. And then go into the login function and say that we now have that connection. We still need the name and the password that we're getting from the form. And actually, since we are separating between email and name, let's just update all of this right now while we're here. And we don't need to separate between password and passcode anymore because we're going to change much of the code down here in a moment. Actually, all of these usernames don't need to exist anymore. And we don't need to do this for each or anything. We'll just jump straight into the database and make some SQL and say SQL equals select star from user where email equals :email and password equals :password semicolon. Then we'll say statement equals connection prepare SQL statement bind param email, comma email, and password. So there we go. And then of course we need to execute, and we need to fetch all. And actually we only want to fetch one, so we can just say fetch. Then we can say if we need to assign this to a result value variable. So if is set results name return true, else return false. So now we're just saying that if this returns something, if we ask the database for a user that has this email and password, then if we get someone who actually has that name, that actually has a name, then we return true. And if it returns nothing from the database, then we just return false. So this is the simplest version for now. So let's refresh this and let's see. Oh, we have a couple of problems here. Undefined constant, that probably means that I forgot a $sign somewhere. And then login function line 11. Login function, that's this file, line 11. Yep, we forgot a $sign. So save, hit refresh. Okay. And let's see if we say Jimmy and password and hit submit. We might get a problem here because I don't think we ever updated undefined key email. So we need to go in here to the form and also say that this name is no longer a name, it's now an email. So save this, go back, refresh, and it says email now. And then Jimmy and password, save. And now we're logged in as undefined key username in logged in line 1. So logged in username. There's no such thing. Let's look here because this is where we assign it. Login function. Where exactly do we say that? We just return true or false. Login function. Login function. We're not setting anything in the session anymore. Let's reintroduce that. Logged in equals true and username equals result name. And we're logged in as Jimmy. So that's great. Because that's what it says on the logged in page, logged in as Jimmy. So we can log out and we can create another user. Johnny also gets the password, and we can hit submit. And oh, we're actually, I tried to log in as Johnny because we don't really have any headers for any of this. Perhaps we should do that. Login form. H2 login. And then do the same on the register page, just so we can see what we're doing, right? Register, there we go. Log in, I'm not trying to log in, I'm trying to register. So let's register Johnny. Johnny and password. Submit, and it says logged in as, and there's this whole thing. So we never set anything because we're not really logged in. We're actually not logged in. So if we go to the front page, it's still going to ask us to log in. But we could do a simple redirect for that. But for now, it doesn't matter. Let's just say Johnny and password can log in. And just to prove that this doesn't work with just anyone. We could say Jackie and then password, and we're not getting logged in. So we have a fully functional login system now. It's not perfect. There's a bunch of problems with it, but there's primarily one that I want to address because it's really, because the way you handle it is very specific to your programming language. So I want to show you how you fix this in PHP. If we go over here to dbeaver and we hit refresh again, then you can see we have Jimmy and Johnny in here, but we can also see that their password is password. There's a bunch of problems with this. First of all, if someone steals the database, they can see all of your passwords. That not only gives them access to your system, but people have a tendency to reuse their passwords. So they'll gain a lot of access from knowing what people's passwords are. The second thing is, your company that uses this database will be able to see these passwords. They shouldn't be. No one should ever be able to see a password. So this needs to be hashed. So let's do that real quick. User registration function. This password right here, we don't want to register the password. We want to say that the password equals password hash and then password. There we go. So now when I register a new user, and we register Jackie, password, I'll hit submit. There's an argument problem here. Let's see, password hash, password. Oh, this expects at least 2 arguments. So let's actually look into the PHP documentation. We haven't done that yet anyways, and it's a really good thing to learn. So PHP password hash. Here's the documentation for this specific function. And you can see here that it requires the actual password, but it also requires an algorithm. Oh, my bad. So you can say password default, password bcrypt, password argon, all these things. We're going to select password bcrypt. And the great thing about PHP documentation is that underneath the actual documentation, you have user examples of things that have been done and used in the past. And there's upvoting on this, so you'll generally get the version that most people like first, so it's not just whatever's been posted the latest. So I just wanted to show you that. And then we can pass that in as the second parameter here, password bcrypt. So I'll hit save and we'll hit refresh. And now, once again, it shows us this error because we did create the user, but it's not properly logging us in at the moment. If we go over into dbeaver and we hit refresh, then we can see that there is a new user, but this password is not something that we can read. That also means that we need a different way of checking people's passwords because we don't know the passwords anymore. So login function needs to just take out the user where the email is whatever was inserted, and then we are taking out the password into our PHP code so that we can check it. So down here we're saying if is set result name, so this means that the user actually exists, and password verify and we're verifying the password against the you can see the documentation here. We have the password and then we have the hash, and the hash is what we got in the database, so that would be our result password. So these are our 2 conditions. We need to actually have found a user, and we need to verify that the password that they typed in matches with the password that is hashed in the database. So let's go back to the login form and see if we can log in as Jackie. We have a problem here in the login function at line 10. What is the problem? Syntax error. unexpected variable statement in line 10. Oh, that's because we're missing a semicolon up here. My bad. So we have the login form now. Let's say Jackie password, and we're logged in as Jackie. And if we log out, then we can see that Johnny, who also exists, if I write his password, then we're not getting to log in as Johnny anymore because it thinks that the password here is a hashed password, and it isn't. So let me show you one more thing with these hashes. Register a new user. We could take Joanna, and password. So I'm using the same password, and that's just the word password in all lowercase letters. And if I refresh down here, we can see another user now, Joanna. But notice how the password hashes are not the same. This is not one-to-one. You won't be able to see that people are using the same password. So a hash is different every time. And the way that this works, it's not like encryption where you encrypt it and then you decrypt it. You hash it and then you make a new hash of the password that was entered to see if it ends up, if you keep hashing it, if it ends up becoming a hash that already existed. We already learned a lot in here. We went through a lot of different PHP topics, but one of the things that's going on right now is we have more and more files. We need even more structure if we need more files than this. We need a whole folder structure and an easy way to get around this and a proper way that you could use in a bigger or larger scale project. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce a framework. We're going to start using the MVC framework, which is the proper design pattern for most web applications. So I'll jump over here and say github.com/skill session. Here you can see there's a couple of public repositories. One of them is called MVC. You can just go to skill session/MVC, by the way. And in here, if you make the window a little bit bigger, we have this tab called code, and we can say download zip. You can, of course, fork it or do other things if you're good at Git. And now that I have this file here, I can just rename the folder to Birdie, whatever we want to call our project, and then move that into our workspace. Yes, please add it to here. So at first glance, it might seem a little bit overwhelming. I have a whole video that goes in great detail about MVC and with this framework in particular. So you can go and watch that if you want more information on it. But just basically remember that we had the index file here. We had the index file before where we're setting up error handling and we're opening the session. We have the same thing in an index file here. What we do have is that we have an AJAX file here. It's a little bit complex, but basically what it does is that it tells us no matter what URL is written up here, it's just going to go to the index.php. Then the index.php initializes from this folder app that's not available to the outside. So that's in it. So it just requires that. It requires a router, database, and controller. And then the index file creates a new router. The router then tells us what files we want to go into based on the parameters of the URL. So one more thing that we want to do with this folder is, of course, that we want to open a new terminal. And again, if you're in Windows, just open the folder, go to the address bar, type cmd, enter, then it's going to open your command prompt and write php-s localhost :8081, because we already have a different PHP instance on port 8080. And then the way that this works, localhost 8081, there's a bunch of errors here. Don't bother too much with that right now. The way that this works is that when you put a /, then the first word that you put here is going to be your controller. The next is going to be a function in that controller, and then it's going to be some parameters. So remember how I said that our own index file here kind of just structured things in the way that a controller would? Well, that's what a controller is. So we have our controllers here, an API controller, a home controller, and a user controller. And we can see in our router that our default controller is the home controller, and the default function to be called in the home controller is index. So if we don't write anything up here, it's going to write home and it's going to write index, or it's going to do the equivalent of that. So that also means that what we're calling right now is the index function of the home controller. And this just does a bunch of different things, and that's actually why it's failing, and none of this makes any real sense. So it's just a way to show how to call a service, how to call a model, and how to show something in a view. So since we know how to work with these things, or at least I'll show you how to work with these things, we don't actually need to do that right here. What do we have? It's the dog fact that's causing a problem right now. So let's just delete that. And I think there's a service down here called dog service, and we can completely delete that service as well. Just move that to the trash. So if we hit refresh, we don't have any error messages here, and we can start working with this. There's a bunch of code in here that just shows how to achieve different things, how to view the past parameters, and how to insert images, how to get those from different places. But generally we have a couple of different things inside the folders here. So we have a public folder. That's the files that are going to be available to the public. So our images, our CSS, our JavaScript, those things. We have our index file. Then we have an installation folder that contains the SQL that you need to run in order to start this up. And then you have the actual application that consists of MVC, stands for model, views, and controller. So that's the basic thing. The core is where we have the things that make everything work, including the router. And then we have something called services, which is something you use to integrate with other applications. So let's look at this install script. We have some SQL right here. So this is going to create a database for us. If you go into a controller, like the user controller, you can see that we have register, login, and it just looks the same things, right? Is this a post method? Are you already logged in? Those things. I think this should be pretty readable, but we'll go through the things as we change things around here. We also have our models. So our models is where we communicate with the database. So this is where we actually log in. And we have a registration form. And once again, this should be very similar to what we had before. The primary thing that you might not have seen in what we've done so far is this filter sanitized string. So what this does is that it just removes any form of code that might be in the string. So if someone's trying to inject code into our page, we're avoiding that by doing this. But actually, there's a better way of doing that, and we'll get back to that later on. So the last thing is the views, and the views is where we have all of the HTML. So we have the login form, once again, very similar to what we just built. The registration form, also very similar to what we just built. And then we have a table here, just to show how to build a table. And then we have a template. And the funny thing about the template is that this actually has the whole HTML structure, but then it includes all of the files that you might need in order to work with something. And when we call a view from our controller, what we really do is that we set what file we want to insert into this template. Now, if we take a look at this migrations, because we want to set everything up, right, then it wants us to work with a database that's just called MVC, but we were working with the Twitter database, right? So we'll just change this MVC to Twitter, then we still have the migration file so we can set it up on other computers later on. That's why we keep the SQL code here, so we can work with the same code simultaneously on different computers and have it as part of our GitHub repositories. We had a slight difference here. We used serial here instead. And we also had a name, right? So we had a name that was just a varchar. I think we had any restrictions on it. So this would be very similar to the SQL that we wrote in our own project, basically the same. And what we want to do then is go into the core to dbconfig to configure our database and say we're using the Twitter database. Our username and password is root and root, or at least it is for me. It's probably different for you. But these things need to be set up in order for everything to work. So if I hit refresh, I can go into login now, and let's see if I can say Jackie and the password. Well, it looks like I can. I can try and go into the restricted area. Congratulations, you've reached the restricted site. And if I log out, that's fine. So there is a built-in login system in this template already. And so because of that, let's just minimize the PHP course folder and then continue working in the Birdie folder, because that's using the MVC template, and that's going to make it much easier for us to get an overview of the things that we're doing here. So if we're going to build a Twitter-like system, then we need the ability to post something. We need some kind of a feed, right? So let's create a controller for that. And the easiest thing to do is just to copy an existing controller. So copy and paste. And then this is going to be our or feed or post controller, tweet controller. Then of course we need to change the name of the class up here to tweet controller. And then we have all of our functions in here, and we don't need to log in, log out, and all users and all that kind of stuff. So we'll just keep the index function, because that's the function that's being called if we don't call any other specific function. And it's not implemented right now, but that's fine. We'll go into models, and once again, we'll just copy and paste the user model, and we'll make a tweet model. And once again, that doesn't need a login function or register function or anything. This is just where we're going to work with all of our database things. And that's why it extends this database class, this general database class that you can find in the core. But that's where you have the connection and everything. And then, of course, we're going to need a view. And we have our views, once again, separated into folders based on the views that we have. So let's make a folder here that's called tweet. And inside of that, we'll make an index file, index.php. Tweets go here. So let's go into the controller, and let's make this the primary page. So if we say router, and then the general controller is going to be the tweet controller. Then when I hit refresh, we're going to have a couple of problems here. That's fine to begin with. We need to fix those. And right now it's taking a parameter, so it's expecting some form of parameter to come in here. And by the way, this is the tweet index function that's not implemented. So refresh, and we have the tweet index function not implemented. So let's write this view and then tweet, because it's in the tweet folder, and we're looking for the file that's called index, and that's actually enough for now. So I'll save this, hit refresh, and you can see that now we have the whole template, and we have the same text, but now it's inside the template. We have the footer, we have the header, everything is great. At some point, we'll want to add a view back to this. So we would say view back, and then we would say equals blah, 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 bunch of things. But let's just define that there is a view back so we can pass it along right here. Then we can go into our view index here, and we would like to have a couple of things here. We want the ability to make a new tweet, but I suppose that should only be possible if you're logged in, right? So PHP if is set session logged in then we'll have the ability to and if then we'll have the ability to post a tweet or to tweet. So I'll make a form. Inside that form, we'll want a text area. And we'll want a button of the type submit. And we'll want to say tweet. And the button. There should probably be a line break in between these two. So that's fine. See, we're not logged in, so, or we actually, no, we're not logged in. So if we log in here and say Jackie and password, then we can actually see this. It's really annoying that this has to pop up every time. Okay, so we can actually see this now. That's great. So we need this form to do something. So I'll say method equals post, because generally when you post something, you should actually post it rather than get, as we've been doing so far. So we'll post it and say that the action is going to be /tweet. And inside of the tweet function, we'll actually make a function called tweet inside the tweet class. So, sorry, this is the tweet controller that needs a public function tweet. And in here, we're going to call the model. This model tweet. And we'll just call a function in here called tweet as well. There we go. And then inside the tweet model, we'll make a function called tweet public function tweet. And that function should then do something with the database. And instead of just writing everything all over, let's just see how we register users, right? So jump over in here. We want to put something in the database too. It's not a user, but it's not that different. So what did we have in here? We have our tweet index. Our text area doesn't have a name, so that's never going to give us anything. So the name is actually just going to be tweet. And if we go over here, then we'll have that tweet. We don't need any passwords or anything. We'll just want to insert into the tweet table that doesn't exist yet. We'll want to insert a user ID, because we need to know who tweeted this. And we'll want to insert the actual tweet. And that's going to be the user ID and the tweet. And this needs to say tweet as well. And we need to bind these two parameters. So that's going to be the user ID that we're going to get from the session. And then it's going to be the tweet that we took just before. So this is going to be executed, and then it's going to return something. It actually doesn't have to return anything. So let's just save this and go back to the tweet controller and say this is going to post that. So let's just try it out. It's probably going to fail, but then we'll figure out what's wrong. Undefined variable view bag in tweet controller, by the way. Okay, so I guess it doesn't really care about this, care for this. Save, hit refresh, no errors. My first tweet. Let's tweet it. Base table view not found. twitter.tweet. Yeah, of course. We're trying to put something into a table that doesn't exist. So the way to work with this is we should go into migrations and say create table. We're going to copy paste the code out of here in a moment, but we should put it here first. So create table, tweet. And what do we need there? Well, we need a tweet ID, which is going to be serial primary key. We need an actual tweet. So that's going to be a varchar. Yeah, because that's the thing with tweets, right? They have a limited length. So let's just say 254. That's the maximum number of characters in a tweet, or at least in this version. So that's everything there is to a tweet. Actually, it isn't. A tweet comes from a user, so we need a user ID, which is going to be a big int because serials are big ints. Unsigned. Not null. There we go. So this is going to be our code for it. I'll jump into dbeaver, and in Twitter here, I'll say create table tweet. I'll hit save. Oh, sorry, I don't have to save anything. No database selected. Let's write use Twitter. There we go. And then on the Twitter, let's refresh this. See? No? Was there an error? Empty query string. There we go. Refresh. There we go. Tweet. And we can see everything about tweets here. So that's perfect. And we can actually just try and refresh. Continue. Integrity constraint violation. Column user ID cannot be null. Of course. That's true. So let's go in here and make sure that we... well, we actually did set a user ID, didn't we? It must be because there's no user ID in the session. Let's try echoing this just to see if it exists. And let's just write something that draws a lot of attention to ourselves. There we go. Save, refresh, continue. And see, there's no actual user ID in here. So I suppose what we need is to go into the user and say, whenever you log in, well, the login function doesn't actually do very much. What does it do in the controller? User controller login. See, here it says, here it sets logged in to true. But I suppose it shouldn't really do that here. If we go back and do it in the model, then we can do more with it. So user here, login. Then we'll just say if this happens, and we still return true. And else we'll return false. This is what we did in a single line just before. But now we have the ability to add something to it here and say that user ID equals result user ID. There we go. And this actually means I'll want to use the code down here because that's more in line with what we've been working with today. So we're saying select email password from user where email is the email. There we go. And then we say fetch. Fetch all would get multiple rows, but we just want to fetch this one thing. And then we verify the password with password hashing against the password that was sent in against the hashed password from the database. And if all this is true, then we log in by saying that logged in is true, and we set the user ID. So save this, and then we need to go back. We need to go here and we need to log out, and then we need to log back in because we need to run this code, right? So Jackie and password, close, never. So I'm back in, and hello tweets. See, we're still not getting a session user ID. And that's of course because we never asked for a user ID here. So we can't really add it in. So let's try one more time. Log out, log in, Jackie, password, submit, tweet. Stop this. Hello world. And now there's actually a number in here. So obviously we need to remove this weird line, but we should be able to see in here that we have some kind of data in the table. Hello world. That's not what I wrote, was it? Didn't I write hello tweet? Oh, anyway. So user 3 actually tweeted hello world. And we could go back here and say, oh, that was what I wrote. Hello Twitter. I can write that, and I can go here and hit refresh, and now it says that as well. Now, we're getting to a blank page every time that we do this. So let's go into the tweet controller and say, whenever you did this, let's make a header that's going to redirect us. That also means that when we redirect, we go from that post method into a get method. And that way people won't accidentally tweet the same thing twice by hitting refresh. So that's a great thing about headers. So location, colon, / tweet. Here we go. Yes, I'll tweet the same thing again just to see that this works. That means that we do have the same tweet twice over here. Refresh. Don't want to save the changes. So now we have the same thing twice. And we get back to this page every time that we tweet something. So the next thing we want to do is, of course, we want to list all of our tweets right under here. So let's go into our controller and let's make that viewBag then. ViewBag equals this model. So that's the tweet model we want to get something from, and then get tweets. Notice that I'm avoiding using capital letters and using snake case instead. So get tweets. Actually, let me say get all. Then tweets and public function. Get all. Now here I'm gonna write something really simple. I'm gonna say SQL equals select star from tweet. There we go. And I don't even need to bind any parameters or anything. I'm just copying this to save time. Statement equals fetch all. We need to assign that to a variable. Actually, we can just return it. So return fetch all, and then we'll say PDO : fetch assoc, because otherwise it's gonna do things twice. So there we go. We should have that in our viewBag now, so we can pass the viewBag along. And then go into our view, tweet, index, and say down here, we'll just want some PHP just to simply show us, remember the pre, and print R, viewBag, semicolon, save, and hit refresh. Declaration of tweet get all must be compatible get all table. Okay, so there's something here that's not accurate. Tweet get all doesn't take any arguments. Tweet controller doesn't ask for any arguments. So what's the problem here? It's in the tweet model on line 17. Tweet model on line 17. Public function get all. So the problem is tweet get all must be compatible with database get all. So the database class that we're extending here already has a function that's called get all. So let's just say tweets. Actually, let's see why this is the case. Core, database, and then get all. So this means that we can just get everything from a table. So this is actually doing everything for us. So even though this would do exactly what we needed, we can just remove it, go back to the tweet controller and say that we want all of the tweet, because this function already exists in something that we inherit. And it just needs to know the name of the table then. Call to protected method database get all from scope. Okay, so I think this really needs to not have that protected scope. So we'll call it public. When it's protected, it's only available from the classes that inherits from it. If it was private, it would only be available from other functions within this file or within this class. But when it's public, it's available from anywhere that calls it. So we'll do this, and you can see here that we actually have all three tweets available to us. Now, this is obviously ugly. So let's jump into our view and make it pretty. Now, one thing that I'm actually unsure of in this template is whether or not we already have Bootstrap, because there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, right? So in our head section, partials, head, do we already have Bootstrap? We don't. So let's just get Bootstrap. Go. We can see things already looks a little bit different. No, it just zoomed, didn't it? Okay. So that's fine. Let's jump into the index section here and say, instead of just printing it like this, we'll make a for each. View back. And actually, we should call this something, tweets. So let's jump into the controller and call it something. Say view back tweets. And I'm just doing that because we might want to put other things into the view back later on. So tweets, jump down here into the index file again and say for each of them, we want to do something. And for each. And we don't need the pre anymore because we're not working with that array printing anymore. Now we'll actually want to create a div of some form that contains these different things. We have the tweet ID, the user ID, and the tweet itself. So let's do a couple of things here. Header 3 is going to be the user, colon, and then we'll just print out the user ID, which is going to be tweet user ID, because we're going to say as tweet like we did before. And then underneath that, we're going to have a paragraph where we will write the actual tweet. There we go. So now everything is printed by user 3, but there's nothing called array to string conversion on line 14. So it doesn't like this. Of course, we need to take the actual tweet from the tweet. So it says hello world, hello Twitter, hello Twitter. Now a tweet would actually contain a couple things more, right? So so let's add when was it created? And then we'll also actually want to print out the name of the user. So the way that we work with this is that instead of altering the code that came before it, we'll add more code to the bottom of it. So alter table tweet add created at timestamp default current timestamp. Because that way I can just take this line of code, I can copy it in here, and I can run it, and all of my coding buddies can do the exact same thing. When I go here and I say refresh, then I have a new column. Now, these all just got the current timestamp when I insert the table, but when I insert something new, it's going to get that new timestamp. So this new tweet has a later timestamp. And that means that this timestamp is available to us now as something that we can write out in a small created add. So there we go. Refresh. Now that's something that we actually write. And let's just add a little bit of styling to this. In the public folder, we have our CSS. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I'll just say that small is supposed to be font size 12 pixels, color gray, something like this, and then it's going to be float right. There we go. So the next thing that we want is we want to write the name of the user here instead, right? So we can't do that right now because we don't actually have that information. But if we go back into tweet here, we had that function just before, and we actually took it from the database where it said get all. So we'll just change the name to allow us to use it again. So get tweets, select star from tweet. But we don't want to just do that anymore. We'll want to join user using parenthesis user ID. And this means that now we have all of the user information available to us along with these things. But another thing that we want to change, since we're changing the SQL anyway, is that right now we get the latest tweet last. We want the latest tweet as the first, right? So let's just add that as well. Order by created add descending. Save, hit refresh. Is it ascending? Oh, no, it isn't. We're not using the right function. from the tweet controller. We still use get all. We need to use get tweets. And then we don't need any parameters because it's specific to that one. So now we have the latest one on top. So we have the new ordering and we do have the username available. We just need to use it inside of our view. So if we go in here now, we can say name. And we can refresh and we can see that the user is Jackie and we don't actually need to do anything like that. We can just say Jackie new tweet and I can write something more elaborate up here, like saying, hi guys, I'm super excited to post my first proper length tweet. And it becomes the first one up here. Again, let's just spend a little bit of time making this just a little bit prettier. So we did get Bootstrap in here. So let's say Bootstrap card. And we have something called cards in Bootstrap, and we'll simply just find a type of card that doesn't have anything in it. See, this is very similar to what we'd actually expect from a tweet. So we'll just copy this and then add that into our for each loop here. So save this, and then the card title is going to be the tweet name. Let's just see, card subtitle. We could actually add the timestamp there. And then in the card text, we could add the actual tweet. And then for the links, I'm not going to remove those quite yet because I have plans for those. So if we save this, jump over into our template and refresh, then it's going to look like this. But obviously we still have the old code right here. Let's remove that and do this. That's great. We have the class card right here. So I want to do just a couple of minor things with it. Let's jump into the CSS. And first of all, say that, well, this small thing, we don't need that anymore, but dot card needs a bit of margin around it. 12 pixels, please. There we go. And then they should have a width of what? 400 pixels? Because this is just annoying to look at. There we go. But of course, it should have a max width of like 80% of the screen or something, which is also important. And we're just saying important in order to override Bootstrap here. 90%. Great. So my idea down here is that we want to make reaction buttons. And for that, we're going to need font awesome. So font awesome, CDN. We'll go down here and we'll copy the link tag. Go in here to our partials, find the head, and right after we import Bootstrap, we also import font awesome. So that's great. We don't need that anymore. And then we need some kind of visual for that, right? So in our tweet index file, we have these links down here, right? What if there was a link here to like something, or, you know, we could say, what if something font awesome sad? What if something makes you sad? I like the latest version. Thank you very much. So we have this version right here, and I'll just copy this. Then we could have another one to say that something makes you mad or angry, right? Icons happy. And then we could have something that makes you angry. So there we go. And if we go in here, then we have these reactions down here. And let's do something with that as well, style-wise. .card link with 24 pixels. Height 24 pixels. I suppose that needs to be important too. And actually, that's not how you change the size of font. Awesome. And I also didn't probably end the code block. So I'll save here, refresh, and this is how we do it. There we go. So now we can do that, and I suppose we can float them right too. Or maybe even better, we'll just say that the text align is right. Anyway, that's not the most important part of this. If we want to do that, we need to include it in an element that could support that. So div class card links div. Then that's the one that needs to have this style. So now they're on the right side. Cool. But I want to be able to click these. So each of them should have a link on them. And they already have a hyperlink reference, but this should be tweet, React, and then we should have the tweet ID and the reaction. So the tweet ID, we have that. We can get that just like this. Tweet ID. And then the reaction needs to match the smiley, of course. So that's going to be sad, glad, then mad. Sad. Save, refresh, and then sad, glad, mad. There's just something strange about that that setup, because we had the good one in the middle. So refresh, glad, sad, mad. So how bad is this? Good, is it bad? Is it really bad? Okay, and I'll want to react to these by saying, you can see down here that it shows what it's going to do when I hover the mouse over it. So it says tweet react 5 glad in all capital letters. So I'll jump into the tweet controller and say public function react, and then it's going to take a tweet ID and a reaction. And then I'm going to say this model React to, the model is still called tweet, but the function is called React. And we will send the tweet ID and the reaction along. And after we're done with this, we can just go back to the tweet side, right? So tweet. And that means that we need a function called React. And I'll just copy this and go into to tweet, because this is going to be the name of the function. So public function and then paste. Tweet ID and reaction. So we have that in here right now. And for this, I'll just say SQL is going to be insert into reaction. We'll have a user ID, we'll have a tweet ID, and we'll have a reaction values, colon user ID, colon tweet ID, colon reaction. And let's just copy this because it's so close to what we're doing right now. We're preparing the statement. We're adding the user ID. We need the tweet ID to be a tweet ID. And then all we really need is the actual reaction. Now, obviously, we don't have a table to support this yet. So let's create that. Migrations, go over here, create a table, reaction. Then we'll give the reaction a reaction ID, maybe. Well, we could actually do something different. I think we will do something different. Let's make this as a relational table. So this is the relationship that a user has with a tweet, right? How does that user feel about that tweet? So we'll just give it a user ID, big int, unsigned, not null. Then we'll have a tweet ID with the exact same parameters. And then we'll have the actual reaction. And the reaction is going to be an enum where we have glad, sad, and mad to choose from. So we'll copy this. I'll jump over into dbeaver. I'll take my code here, paste it, go up here, then click run. And then I'll refresh out here to see that now there's the table called reaction. So now let's just try reaction and see whatever error it is that we need to fix. So I'm saying glad right here. And I'm going into the reaction table, double clicking on it. And it actually worked in the first attempt. So that's all great. But there's a couple of things that I want to add as specific details here. First of all, I'll want to be able to see if I already reacted to a tweet. So how do we do that? Well, we already take out the tweets up here in the tweet model. So when we get the tweets, we should be able to join reaction on reaction dot user ID equals colon user ID. So that means that now we need to bind a parameter to get that user ID in here. And just to make everything a little bit more similar, because that's actually pretty important when you do code, I'll add this to a variable called SQL. I'm not saying it's important to add it to a variable, it's just that that's what we're doing everywhere else. So we should try and be consistent with the way that we put things together, so it's easy to see that something's being repeated. This should, first of all, this is going to be a problem because the default join in MySQL is going to be inner join. So let's jump into the view and see what it is that we have. So after all of this, let's do the pre. And then PHP print r view back tweets. Save, refresh, and then we have them underneath here. So we actually do have the reaction down here, but it always just says glad, right? And that's not accurate. But that's of course because we're always joining whatever reaction comes from this user. We're completely disregarding the tweet. So let's jump into it again and say tweet here, join reaction on reaction.user ID equals the user ID, and reaction.tweet ID equals tweet.tweet ID. So now if we hit save, we hit refresh, we only get this one post because that's the only one we reacted to, and the default join is an inner join. So let's do a left join instead. And now we have all of the posts down here, and we can see that the first one here has the reaction glad, but the other ones just don't have any reaction to it, reaction to them. Now we have a different problem. Our user ID and our tweet ID works on the first one here, but they don't work on the last one here. And that's because they're being overridden, because we have multiple tables that have the same values in them. So let's define exactly what it is that we want, where we want these things from. So user ID, let's get that from the sorry, what I'm trying to say is we're getting these things from various columns, right? Or from various tables. And the last table that we join is the reaction table. And the reaction table actually has a user ID and a tweet ID. But when there's no reaction from this user on this tweet, then the last value to overwrite these columns is going to be null values. And that's why these are empty. So let's just specify that we want these from other places. So let's say user.user ID, tweet.tweet ID, and then we'll want tweet.tweet. We would also like tweet.created at. We would also like user.email, and the password we actually didn't want to begin with anyway, so maybe it's great that we're doing this. User.name, and then of course reaction.reaction. And then of course we don't want the star. So now we have this. .created at is a problem. Tweet.created at. Why is that a problem? Well, actually, when it comes to tweet, we just want everything. And that might be even easier because we don't need to specify this then. Just want everything from a tweet from a user. We want the ID, email, and the name. And then of course with the reaction, we want the reaction. So it's not going to let us use dot star. That's interesting. Let's just see if there's something else wrong here. Dot tweet. It really seems like there's a problem. Did I misspell something? Tweet here? No. Oh, I'm just missing a comma, that's all. Okay, so what's going on here? User ID, user email, user name. Oh, tweet. There we go. So created that is not coming in right now, but tweet.created add, comma. Now that works. There's a big issue here from line 21 in the card link. That's a bit odd. Let's see what's going on. Line 21, 22, and 23. It just somehow breaks something. Let's take a look and see what's going on. It's the hyperlink reference that has some undefined key in it because we don't have the tweet ID with us. Go. Refresh. So now the links should work again. Cool. So that also means that now that we have these reactions, glad up here, we should be able to note when these are used. So we can go into the tweet. And for each of these, we can say that it should be green if we already selected it. So let's take a look here. This is the link, right? PHP, if tweet created at. No, if tweet reaction. Actually, I just got an even better idea. Instead of all this if, else, and then do all these things, let's jump directly into this class and just say that inside this class, we'll just print it out. Tweet the reaction. And if there is no reaction, there's a shortcut for that as well. We'll just print nothing, because otherwise it's going to throw an error and put this error text into our HTML that we don't want. So here we go. We're saving all of that. Refresh. And now in this first one, I think we did react to that and say we were glad with the first one. So it has this class on it, and we can just go directly for that in our CSS to say that if something is either glad, sad, or mad, then it gets a different color. So dot sad, dot glad, dot mad, color equals red. Yeah, okay, of course that doesn't really make sense, because now it's just red if there is a reaction at all. So we need to connect it with the one before it to say that if it's smiling and glad. So if these exist at the same time, or if the sad one exists at the same time as the word sad, or if the angry one exists at the same time as the word mad. And by the way, the dot here means that we're looking for a class out here. So let's save this, hit refresh, and now our reactions become red. The thing that I want to do is I want to make these buttons asynchronous, right? Because right now, if I scroll down here and I react to something, if I react to the last one, then it's going to go up to the top of the page because it's reloading the page. It's jumping over to the controller, it's doing the whole reaction, then it's reloading the page. And sure enough, I do have the reaction on this page, but that's it, right? I wanted to just, color it red and do the thing, register the reaction, but not anything else beyond that. Not jump to the top of the page. So I'll want to do this asynchronous. And how do we do that then? Let's jump in here and add a add a little bit of JavaScript to this. So let's say that the hyperlink reference becomes square. That means don't do anything hyperlink reference wise. We do have another one down here that we'll need to remove then. But then we say on click, we'll want to call a function, and that function is going to be called react. And our reaction, or actually reaction, and the reaction needs to know what tweet we're reacting to. So that's going to be this. And it needs to know, actually, no, let's just give it the tweet ID. We might as well. And it needs to know what the reaction is going to be. So we'll put that in single quotes. So now that we have that, we can replace the hyperlink reference with this every single time. But actually, let's just copy one of these and just keep it down here, because we're going to need it in a moment when we're going to define what the function is going to do. So just to keep things together, we can put the script in here for now. Script. And then we're creating the function that's called reaction. And in that we'll have a URL. And by the way, this is JavaScript, not PHP. But there's a reason I'm putting this into this tutorial. And I'll get to that in just a moment. So the URL is going to be this URL. And then we'll want to make an asynchronous call on that URL. And actually, let's take the tweet ID and the reaction. Plus tweet ID plus / plus reaction. There we go. And this needs to be a bar or a let or something. So once we have that, we can say var XML HTTP equals new XML HTTP request. Then we can take that XML HTTP and say on ready state change equals function and then write an anonymous JavaScript function here. Inside of that, we'll say if this dot ready state equals 4 and this dot status equals 200, that's the HTTP response code, then documents dot get element by ID. Actually, we can just pass the element along. So let's just say object like this, and then up here we can just say this. And by the way, this should be sad. This and mad this. So now that we have that, we can just say object dot class list dot add reaction. That should do it. But we might want to do one more thing, which is that we'll want to say console.log this dot response text, because then if an error happens, we have PHP error handling turned on. That was one of the first things that we did, and we've been using it a lot throughout this tutorial, right, or throughout the course. So now that we're calling things asynchronous, we have no way of seeing if something goes wrong, except if we choose to put it into our console. So that's why I'm doing this. Now, this is not going to run itself, so XML http.open get then the URL and then true, and XML http dot send. There we go. So this is going to happen on click now. So let's try. It might not work first attempt, but let's try it out. We'll refresh the page, and now you can see that it actually says /tweet and then hashtag, but that's because we're already on the tweet page. So that's just the way it phrases it. It's not going to do anything. Now, another thing that I want you to notice is that we actually haven't restricted anything to say that you can only have one reaction. You can be mad and glad at the same time here. So we're still actually moving to the top of the page. But that's one thing. Let's go out here and see what happens in the inspector. Reaction is not defined. So what's the problem here? Tweet line 43. That's not necessarily accurate. Let's just refresh the page to begin with. Okay, so there's a couple of errors to begin with. So this dot ready state. It's not really happy with this line. Oh, it's possibly because we have this. So let's refresh. Yeah, so once again, I just assigned instead of comparing. So refresh up here, and then let's try clicking something. And you can see that we're actually getting a lot of stuff back here. We're getting a whole view back because that's what the controller does. But what I'm interested in seeing is this longer tweet. Does it actually have the reaction sad now? It does. So it got that reaction. And I should be able to see that over here in dbeaver as well. We have the reactions here. I'll refresh them. And the user is always user 3. And for tweet ID 5, that's the latest tweet. It doesn't exist. Let's refresh. Here it is, tweet number 5. And for tweet number 5, we have both the reaction glad and sad. And if I hit mad, then it's gonna asynchronously also include mad. So obviously I should do something to make sure that we can only have one of these reactions. The way that I could do that would be to go into migrations here once again, add a little bit of code and say alter table reaction, and then add unique as a constraint. We call this our unique constraint. And then make a parenthesis with all the things that I want to go into it to say user ID, tweet ID, and what's it called, reaction. To just say that by themselves, we can have the same user multiple times. We can have the same tweet multiple times. We can have the same reaction multiple times. But when all three of them are the same, then we have a problem. Actually, we don't need reaction here because the whole point is that you can have any reaction that you want. You can just only have one reaction between a user and a tweet. So this would be our SQL for that. We can copy it and we can go into dbeaver and we can run this, but I think it's gonna fail because we are already not following this. So when we look here, see these last two lines here, they actually shouldn't be here because the constraint won't allow them. So we cannot add a constraint that's already not being upheld. So we need to delete, let's just delete everything from tweet ID 5. So delete from reaction where tweet ID equals 5. There we go. And if we go into reaction and we refresh, then we can see that they disappeared. And that means that that the code that we just copied before, we can run that now. And then the next time that we try to say that we're also sad about this, it's not going to make any difference here in the reaction table. Oh, it is, of course. And if I refresh the page, I can also see it here, but that's because we didn't have any reactions to the first one. So if I click the next one here, I can actually see, first of all, over here, if I refresh, that it didn't generate another reaction from the same user. And I can also see here in my console that because I made this piece of code right here, console log the response text, the PHP error message is actually getting out here in my console. So I can see the problem, that it's because I have an integrity constraint violation. Now, the solution to this would obviously be to go into the reaction model. Sorry, to go into the tweet model under reaction. And then whenever you have a reaction, try and see if there is one already so that you change the existing one, if that's the case, and otherwise you create a new one. And that makes this function a little bit bigger and a little bit more cumbersome. And we're not going to do that because I actually believe that with everything we've been through in this course so far, you're perfectly capable of doing that yourself. So let that be a little extra challenge for you. So now that we've done this AJAX call, we've actually started to move a little bit in the direction of separating the front end from the back end. Because when we're doing an AJAX call, we're calling something asynchronous. We're doing something where the HTML and the PHP is not coupled so tightly together. And that's definitely what we want to do. That's definitely the direction that we want to go in with our application. So generally, what we'll really want to do is we'll want to create a front-end application that works in and of itself. But in order to do that, we need the backend to support it. So that means that we need a version of the backend that isn't caught up in trying to do everything for us and trying to decide how everything looks. Because right now, this application right here, it doesn't decide what the database looks like. We have the migrations SQL, but basically we're writing the SQL inside of our SQL application. It should only define what the backend, what the server code looks like. So if we take the tweet controller here, we basically have 3 different functions, and 2 of them only accept data. And then the last one, and then they redirect. The last one actually sends out some data, but in a view. So if we copy all of this and then we go into the API controller, then let's just delete all of these ugly things here. We have a user and users and stuff like that. That's all fine. But you can see here that we have the constructor here. And a constructor is a function that's always called before any other function inside the class. So whenever a function in this class is called, this function is called first. So that means that we are setting a header called content type with the value application JSON. So we're actually printing out JSON from all of the functions in this class. So we'll paste whatever we copied from before and say that this is going to be tweets plural because we are trying to get the tweets. We could even call it get tweets or whatever. And then we still do the same thing with the view back right here, except maybe we don't need to say that it's tweets, it's just the tweets. And then we just say echo JSON and code. We can just copy one of the others here. Echo JSON and code our tweets and do JSON pretty print. If someone's tweeting something, that's great. We should probably echo some kind of okay message, but we don't have to. And we can also react right here. So no one's redirecting or anything. We're just accepting a couple of calls and we're allowing a call. And up here, we have an array of things that we can do. So we can add it to this and say, tweets returns all tweets as JSON. Then we can say tweet lets you post a new tweet. And we also had react /i/j so this lets you react to a tweet. I equals the tweet ID and j equals reaction. And then remove the comma here. So now when we go to the API, we can see that we have these different things that we can go for. And we can say tweets, API/tweets. Now we can see all of the tweets in a JSON format, and we could call this directly from a JavaScript application. So what that means is that we can now create a completely separate application just for the front end that calls this API instead of having the PHP write parts of the HTML. No, we'll just write the HTML. Then we'll write some JavaScript along with it that fixes that HTML and fills it out by calling this API. And the great thing about that is that not only can you replace your whole front end, if you want to work with Angular, that's cool. Just scrap the old front end and build an Angular front end. Want to replace Angular with React? You can just do that. And you can keep replacing your front ends without having to do anything in the back end at all. And moreover, because one thing is replaceability, but what when you want to expand these things? If you're going to build a native iOS app, guess what? You're going to have to build that in Xcode and you're going to have to learn how to build apps. But the data that you're sending to your backend and that you're retrieving from your backend, you can use the exact same API. And that's why it's so powerful to use an API and separate your front-end application instead. Because you'll most likely need multiple different front-end applications for the same app. Anyways, that's the direction the world is going in, right? Now, what a course. We've been through a lot of things today, and hopefully you've learned a lot. And I hope you had as much fun watching this as I had recording it. Now, this has been the PHP course, and I hope that you can see the way that we're structuring our courses, that we try to keep things as separate as possible. So you should be able to completely replace the PHP here with with Java if you wanted to, or C#.NET if you wanted to. You should also be able to replace the database with a different database if that's what you wanted. And you should be able to use a framework like Angular or React or Vue or something with this if that's what you wanted to. And that's the whole point here, that the database can be replaced without replacing the rest. The frontend can be replaced without replacing the rest. The backend can be replaced without replacing the rest. So you can choose exactly the frameworks and the programming languages that you want to work with, and it should work with whatever other programming languages and frameworks you're working with. So I just want to thank you for participating in this, from following along for so long. This has been a long course, and we tried to do this in a bit of a longer format because I had some comments that when I cut these videos up too much, it becomes harder to follow along. So I've done no animations today, no cutting of the video, well, very limited editing anyways. And I hope you enjoyed it, but please leave a comment below so I know exactly how you prefer these formats to be. And with all that out of the way, thank you for today. I'll see you next time. Next up is going to be JavaScript in less than a week. Bye bye.